I used to think the mountain house was the one place no one could interfere with. It sat high above the road, wrapped in pine trees, quiet enough that the loudest sound at night was the wind brushing the roof. I'd owned it for years, long before the surrounding cabins were built and the so-called community association appeared. Every visit followed the same comforting routine: unlocking the door, lighting the fireplace, and feeling that familiar sense of isolation and ownership settle in. That house wasn't just property to me. It was where I went to disconnect, to breathe, and to remember why privacy still mattered. The first sign of trouble came from something that felt absurdly small. A neighbor I barely knew asked, politely at first, whether I could hand over a spare set of my house keys to the association. She said it was for emergency access, the kind of phrase that sounds reasonable until you think about it for more than a second. I declined, calmly, explaining that I was often away and preferred to manage access myself. Her smile tightened, just slightly, as if she hadn't expected resistance. After that, the requests didn't stop. Emails followed, then printed notices slipped into my mailbox whenever I wasn't around. They all repeated the same idea in different words: community safety, shared responsibility, standard procedure. Each one assumed I would eventually give in. I replied courteously every time, reminding them that the house was privately owned and that no bylaws required me to surrender my keys. I thought that would be the end of it. I underestimated how much some people hate hearing no. The tone shifted quickly. What started as requests turned into warnings. The neighbor, the one everyone quietly referred to as Karen, began dropping by unannounced whenever she saw my car. She'd stand at the edge of the driveway, arms crossed, explaining how difficult I was being. I listened, nodded, and repeated myself. No keys. No exceptions. Each conversation ended with her promising to escalate the issue, a phrase she clearly enjoyed using. I still didn't think it would go far. People make threats all the time when they don't get their way. That assumption lasted until the afternoon I arrived at the mountain house to find a police cruiser parked out front. 2 officers stood by the porch, hands resting casually on their belts, while Karen hovered nearby with a look of quiet triumph. She had called them, claiming there was a safety concern and that I was refusing lawful access to my own property. The officers were professional, if slightly confused. I explained the situation, showed proof of ownership, and answered every question calmly. Within minutes, it was clear there was no issue, no law broken, and no reason for them to be there. They left with polite nods and mild apologies. Karen didn't say much as they drove away, but the look on her face told me everything. She wasn't embarrassed. She was frustrated. And as I stood there unlocking my door, I realized this wasn't about safety or rules anymore. It was about control, and she had just shown me exactly how far she was willing to go to try and take it. After the police left, the mountain felt different. The silence that usually calmed me now carried an edge, like something unfinished hanging in the air. Karen didn't apologize or acknowledge that she'd been wrong. Instead, she acted as if the visit had proven her point, as though involving law enforcement was a reasonable step rather than an escalation. That alone told me this wasn't over. People who admit mistakes back down. People who feel entitled look for another angle. The emails started again the very next day. This time, they weren't phrased as requests. They were reminders. She cited vague safety concerns, liability issues, and community expectations, repeating them so often they began to feel scripted. Each message implied that my refusal to hand over my keys was selfish, even dangerous. I replied once, briefly, restating that no law or agreement required me to provide access, and that further contact on the subject was unnecessary. I expected resistance. What I didn't expect was persistence bordering on obsession. Karen began showing up whenever she thought I might be around. Sometimes she brought another board member with her, someone who would stand quietly while she did all the talking. Other times she came alone, clipboard in hand, making notes as if she were documenting a violation that didn't exist. She never crossed the property line, but she didn't need to. Her presence alone was meant to apply pressure. She talked about emergencies, about burst pipes and forest fires, about how irresponsible it was to lock everyone out. Each scenario was delivered with the same rehearsed concern, and each time I gave the same calm response. What struck me was how personal it felt to her. This wasn't about procedure. It was about the idea that someone could refuse her and face no immediate consequences. The association backed her quietly, forwarding her messages and attaching official-looking headers, but none of them could point to a rule I was violating. They relied on tone instead of authority, assuming repetition would eventually wear me down. Neighbors began to notice. A few mentioned, in hushed conversations, that Karen had been talking about my house at meetings. She framed it as a problem property, a risk to the community. Some people nodded along just to avoid being targeted next. Others rolled their eyes and told me to stand my ground. I appreciated the support, but it also confirmed what I already suspected. Karen wasn't going to stop on her own. The pressure peaked when I arrived one weekend to find a printed notice taped to my door. It wasn't legally binding, but it was designed to look like it was. Bold headings. Formal language. A deadline demanding I provide keys for inspection access. It was intimidation dressed up as procedure. I peeled it off, folded it, and set it on the table inside, next to the stack of emails and messages I'd been saving. Despite everything, I still didn't raise my voice or threaten legal action. I wanted a clear record of restraint. I wanted every interaction documented, every escalation traced back to its source. Karen mistook my calm for hesitation. She mistook my patience for weakness. Standing there in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by proof of her fixation, I realized something important. If she was willing to involve the police over keys she had no right to, she would keep escalating until she felt she'd won. And if that was the case, then simply saying no was no longer enough. The breaking point came faster than I expected, and it arrived wrapped in forced smiles and official-looking language. I came up to the mountain house one afternoon to find Karen standing near the driveway again, this time with two other association members. They didn't block my path, didn't raise their voices, didn't threaten me outright. Instead, they spoke in that calm, patronizing tone people use when they believe the outcome is already decided. Karen informed me that the board had discussed the situation at length and concluded that my refusal to provide keys constituted a community risk. She said it slowly, as if explaining something obvious to a child. Then she slid a document toward me. It claimed the association now required temporary access codes or physical keys to all homes for inspection and emergency preparedness. I read it carefully. There were no signatures from legal counsel, no citations of law, just internal policy dressed up to look authoritative. I handed it back and said no. Not angrily. Not sarcastically. Just no. That's when Karen's expression changed. The polite concern vanished, replaced by irritation she could no longer hide. She warned me that if I continued to be uncooperative, she would have no choice but to involve authorities again. I reminded her calmly that the police had already confirmed there was no issue. She smiled tightly and said this time would be different. That was the moment I knew the line had been crossed. 2 days later, I got the call. A different officer, a different tone. This time, the report claimed there was a potential safety hazard and possible code violation related to denied access. When I arrived, Karen was already there, arms folded, watching as if this were a performance staged just for her. The officers were courteous, but firmer than before. They asked more questions, took notes, walked the perimeter. Karen hovered close, offering commentary whenever she could. I answered everything honestly and provided documentation on the spot. Proof of ownership. Copies of previous correspondence. The officers eventually stepped aside to talk privately. When they returned, their conclusion was clear. There was still no violation. No legal basis for forced access. No justification for continued involvement. One of them told Karen, politely but firmly, that this was a civil matter and that repeated calls without cause could become a problem. Karen didn't argue. She didn't need to. The damage had already been done. Neighbors had watched police arrive again. Rumors would spread. The implication alone was enough for her. As the officers left, she looked at me and said, almost casually, that the association would be reviewing alternative compliance measures. It wasn't a threat exactly, but it wasn't reassurance either. That evening, alone in the house, I replayed everything. The calls, the notices, the staged concern. It was clear now that Karen wasn't seeking resolution. She was seeking submission. She believed persistence and pressure would eventually force me to hand over control of my own home. And the association, whether actively or passively, was enabling her. I sat at the kitchen table and spread out the papers I'd been collecting. Emails, notices, police reports, dates and times neatly noted in the margins. What I saw wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a pattern of harassment escalating under the guise of authority. I had tried being reasonable. I had tried being patient. None of it had mattered. That was the moment my mindset shifted. I stopped thinking about how to end the conflict and started thinking about how to make it impossible for her to continue. If she believed access was the issue, then access was exactly where the solution would be applied. Not by giving her what she wanted, but by removing the argument entirely. Sitting there in the quiet, with the mountains darkening outside the windows, I made a decision. The next move wouldn't be emotional or confrontational. It would be precise. And once it was made, there would be no room left for her to push any further. I didn't announce what I was doing next. There was no reason to. Confrontation had only fed Karen's sense of importance, and I had no interest in giving her another stage. Instead, I shifted into planning mode, the same way I always do when a problem refuses to go away on its own. If the conflict revolved around access, then the solution had to address access in a way that was airtight, undeniable, and entirely within my rights. I started by reviewing every relevant document again, this time with a different focus. Not on whether I had to give up my keys, but on how access was defined legally and technologically. There was nothing requiring me to provide physical entry to anyone. In fact, the language around property control was explicit. I was responsible for security. I was responsible for deciding who entered. That responsibility included choosing the method of access. Keys were never mentioned. Locks were barely mentioned at all. From there, I looked at alternatives. Not temporary fixes or compromises, but permanent solutions that would remove ambiguity altogether. That's when the idea of a biometric lock moved from concept to plan. If Karen's argument was that she needed access for emergencies, then a system that allowed controlled, documented entry without surrendering physical keys solved that problem completely. No lost keys. No copies. No unauthorized use. Every entry logged. Every face recorded. I didn't cut corners. I consulted a security specialist who dealt with remote properties and high-risk locations. We talked through options, redundancies, failure scenarios, power outages, connectivity issues, emergency overrides. The system we settled on was overbuilt by most standards, but that was the point. It needed to be unimpeachable. Something no reasonable person could claim was unsafe or obstructive. Installation was scheduled quietly. No HOA notifications. No heads-up emails. The technicians arrived early one morning in unmarked vehicles and worked efficiently. By the end of the day, the old locks were gone. In their place was a sleek, reinforced system with facial recognition, encrypted access logs, and remote management. I tested it repeatedly. My face. Authorized contacts. Denied access attempts. Everything worked exactly as promised. I documented the entire process. Specifications. Certifications. Compliance standards. Manufacturer documentation. I wanted a complete record ready, not because I planned to share it immediately, but because I knew Karen wouldn't be able to resist reacting once she noticed the change. Predictability is useful when you're preparing for the next step. Sure enough, the reaction came quickly. Karen noticed the new hardware within days. She didn't knock this time. She stood at the edge of the driveway, staring at the door like it had personally offended her. Later that evening, an email arrived from the association, asking for clarification about recent security modifications. The tone was cautious now, careful not to accuse, careful not to demand. I replied politely, attaching a brief explanation and emphasizing that the system fully met safety and emergency access considerations without compromising ownership. The silence that followed was telling. No immediate response. No follow-up threats. No sudden visits. For the first time since this started, Karen had nothing to leverage. She couldn't argue that I was blocking access, because access was available, just not on her terms. She couldn't claim safety concerns, because the system exceeded standard security practices. And she couldn't involve the police again, without risking consequences of her own. Internally, the power dynamic had shifted. I could feel it in the sudden restraint, the careful wording, the hesitation. Karen had built her entire campaign around the assumption that control came from physical possession of keys. Once that assumption disappeared, so did her confidence. She was left reacting instead of pushing, questioning instead of dictating. I didn't celebrate. I didn't provoke. I simply waited. Because I knew this phase wasn't about victory yet. It was about watching someone realize, piece by piece, that the ground they'd been standing on had quietly vanished beneath their feet. The end didn't come with another police car or a dramatic confrontation. It came through an email that was noticeably shorter than all the others. The association acknowledged receipt of my explanation, confirmed that the new security system satisfied their stated safety concerns, and informed me that no further action would be taken regarding access to my home. There was no apology, no admission of overreach. Just a quiet retreat wrapped in neutral language. Karen stopped coming by after that. No more standing at the edge of the driveway. No more clipboards or pointed looks. When we crossed paths at a distance, she avoided eye contact entirely, as if pretending I wasn't there might undo what had happened. The shift was unmistakable. The person who once thrived on pressure and escalation now had nothing left to press against. Every argument she'd relied on had been dismantled without raising my voice once. The association's behavior changed too. Messages that once felt accusatory became careful and procedural. They stopped framing suggestions as expectations. They stopped copying half the board on every email. The house was no longer discussed in meetings, at least not openly. What had been labeled a community risk simply disappeared from the conversation. It was as if the problem had never existed at all. From my side, life returned to normal in a way that felt even quieter than before. I arrived when I wanted. I left when I wanted. The lock worked flawlessly, recognizing authorized faces and denying everyone else without explanation or drama. Every entry was logged, every attempt recorded. The system didn't care about personalities or power struggles. It cared about data. And data, unlike assumptions, doesn't argue. Looking back, the most revealing part wasn't the technology or even the outcome. It was how quickly the situation deflated once control was removed from the equation. Karen had never truly been concerned about emergencies or safety. If she had been, she would have welcomed a solution that improved both. What she wanted was leverage. Once that was gone, so was her interest. I never heard from the police again. I never received another notice about keys or access. The association didn't revise its policies publicly, but their caution became obvious. They had learned that persistence without authority carries risks, and that not everyone folds under pressure. Sometimes people adapt. Other times, they simply stop pushing when pushing no longer works. Standing on the porch one evening, watching the light fade over the mountains, I thought about how easily the situation could have gone differently. I could have argued louder, escalated faster, turned it into a spectacle. Instead, I chose precision over reaction. I let documentation replace emotion and systems replace assumptions. The result wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. The house remained exactly what it had always been to me: private, quiet, and firmly under my control. No shared keys. No unwanted access. Just a clear boundary, enforced without conflict. Karen never apologized, but she didn't need to. The silence that followed was enough. Sometimes the most effective response isn't to fight harder, but to change the rules of engagement entirely. When you do that, people who rely on pressure suddenly find themselves with nothing left to apply. And once that happens, the conflict doesn't end with a bang. It simply fades away, leaving only a lesson behind for anyone who thought control was something they could demand instead of earn.